Good day. My name is Willie Crew, and the purpose of this session is to share with you the history of the Life School. And it really is a fascinating story, to say the least. We started out in the late 90s here in South Africa to design a plan to reach the 100 least reached people groups of Southern Africa. It was a huge project, to say the least. We'd involved hundreds of churches in South Africa, and we had involved thousands of churches across Southern Africa. And really, to answer the question before you ask it, by the end of the year 2000, we had the beginnings of a church in 99 of those 100 people groups. But during the time that we were busy putting together the strategy, one of the questions that came up was, what happens as we were thinking toward the end of the year 2000? What happens if we got to the end of the year 2000 and we were now in maybe 30 or 40 of these people groups, and we hadn't reached the rest yet? And of course, for us, it was a matter of, no, that's not the right thing. That's not what we want to do. We wanted to really see that we could hit the mark and that we could reach these people. So we made a decision to actually train 500 short-term missionaries in 7 of the Southern African countries. And as we went setting all that up, I began to wonder myself, what would really happen with these 500 people? How would they represent the kingdom when they are actually released after 6 months of training? And that's where the story of the Life School actually started. We made a decision, after my kind of wondering what would happen, to train 50 people in Pretoria, South Africa, and have those 50 people go and help to lead the 500 that we intended to train in Southern Africa. Our problem was that we didn't know how many, or how rather, to train these people with a curriculum that would really cause them to be almost like a crack squad. We needed people that would be trained well, and so during that time, I happened to be, if there's anything like that in the kingdom, I happened to be in London in the Foreign Mission Club, and I was working with Phil Butler on some partnership issues, and whilst I was there, Dr. Bill Taylor from the World Evangelical Alliance's Missions Commission happened to be in the same building for a different purpose. And he asked me, sent me a message, and he asked whether I could come and sit down and just chat to him for a while. And we sat in the garden of this Foreign Mission Club, and he was asking, well, what are you doing? And I told him about the 100 least reached people groups. I told him how we were going to be mobilizing the churches, etc., and how we were intending to train 500 people in Southern Africa, and then that we would train 50 in South Africa. And then he suddenly asked me, he said, well, how can I help you? And I looked at him, I said, Bill, why don't you try and help me build a curriculum that could train the 50? A curriculum that really would help us to train good mission planters or church planters among unreached people groups. And Bill said, sure, he'll do that. And for a moment, I thought he would take out a pen out of his pocket and he would just, start writing down the curriculum, and this would be it. And he said, I'll come back to you. And a while later, he called me from Texas in the USA, and he said, are you ready to come to a meeting? And I said, sure, and I got on a plane, flew over there, only to find out that Bill had pulled together some of the best mission training minds in the world. And we sat down together and started a process to design this curriculum that took almost 18 months to complete. Well, when eventually we got to the last meeting, where now we were going to receive this curriculum, John Kaiser, who was leading this group of people, a group of trainers, John Kaiser said to me, as he pulled this piece of paper off the printer, he said to me, Willie, you can never tell anyone that we helped you unless you use practitioners to teach this course. And I looked at him and I said, John, what is a practitioner? Because I needed to understand his definition before I even tried to answer the question. And so he said, a practitioner is somebody that doesn't just teach something that he knows in his head, but it's something that he's actually done and that he is doing, and he really understands the subject. And immediately I knew, because I knew the curriculum, I knew that we did not have all of these skills in South Africa. So I said to him, John, where are these practitioners? And he said to me, well, there are many around the world. I mean, many people doing wonderful things. He says, but those that I know, some of them live in Brazil, and others live in Asia, and others live in Africa, and others live in America, and others live in Canada. And I mean, when I listened to that, I said, John, I may never tell anyone that you helped me. And I thought, I'll just go and find a couple of people in South Africa and, put this thing together. So I left there with mixed feelings. I was blessed that I had the curriculum, and I was worried the fact that I couldn't tell anybody who helped me put the curriculum together. And at the same time, I was wondering how and where I would find these practitioners, because what John was saying was really important. So I went back to our team in Pretoria, and I told them what had happened. And when I had told them what happened, they kind of looked at me questioning, so what do you think? And I was like, we cannot afford to do that. I mean, for us to bring these people from different parts of the world to teach 240 hours of video or mission teaching on video was just going to be over the top. It was just going to be too much money. And then one of my team members said, well, why don't we just pray about it? And so I said, okay, well, let's pray about it. And I really thought the Lord was on my side. And after a couple of days of praying and whatever, we came back together again, and we really sensed the Lord say, do it. And so I said to some of my team members, I said, well, why don't you invite these people that John had spoken about, because we gotten the names from him, and I said, I'm sure they won't come in anyways. Who are we here in South Africa? And we wrote these letters of invitation, and to my absolute amazement, all but 3 of them made a commitment to come. The 3 that couldn't come, the reason was that, they had other things going and they just couldn't make it. And so we invited another 3, and once we invited those 3, they also agreed to come, and suddenly we had our whole contingent of people that would be training this live school. Whilst that was going on and we were busy putting these speakers together, we were recruiting 50 students from 5 continents. They came from China, from Europe, from Africa. It was an amazing group of people that we'd pulled together. And we'd gotten those people together from various continents because we wanted to make sure that we have a multicultural audience when the school was being taught. And whilst we were recruiting the 50, another part of our team was back in Africa, busy recruiting 500 people in these 7 schools that we would train them, during the time that we trained the 50. Well, it wasn't long, and all of this was beginning to happen. It was going to be a couple of months, and the 50 would come to Pretoria, the 500 would go to parts of Africa, the speakers would come to us, and we would start to train, and etc. Well, it was during that time that I happened to be in America looking for money to be able to pay for these missionaries in Africa that we were training and wanted now to send to the last of the unreached people groups. And I knew they were going to go to difficult places, and I knew they were going to go to places where there would be no support, and I knew that we would pay their transport, their accommodation, their food, etc. So I was looking for the finances, and while sitting one evening in the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, I had a man that I'd never met before, and by the way, we weren't talking about teaching that evening, we were talking about reaching the unreached, but this man said to me, he said, I want to show you something when we finished having dinner. And so we walked over to his hotel, and he opened a thing like a laptop computer, and John Maxwell was speaking on this laptop computer in English, speaking on leadership as John normally does, and the next moment he flipped a switch and John was speaking in Hindi, and then he flipped a switch and John was speaking in Mandarin, and I looked at Marcus, was his name. I said, Marcus, what in the world is this? And Marcus said, it is digital technology. And immediately my mind, because I'm pretty much of a visionary, immediately my mind went to this curriculum that we have now designed and that we're about to teach in Pretoria. And I said to him, how's about me putting 240 hours on this kind of technology? And he looked at me and he said, it will not be possible. If it's 240 hours, it is way too expensive. There is just no way you'd be able to do that. And he basically talked me out of it. But as I walked out of the hotel room, out of the door of his hotel room, I said to him, Marcus, what is the basis to do this? And he said to me, Willie, you need 3 broadcast quality cameras, you need a full-blown studio, and you need good lighting, and you need. And the more he spoke to me, the more he talked me out of it. Well, the next day I was flying from Atlanta back to South Africa, and it was me and the Lord on the plane. I'm sure some of you have had that experience. I was saying to the Lord, yes, Lord. No, Lord. Yes, Lord. No, Lord. Until eventually I won, and I said, no, Lord. And by the time I got home back to my team in South Africa, I told them about this extraordinary meeting that I had with Marcus. And then immediately said to them, because I was worried they're going to tell me go pray about it again, immediately said to them, but I don't believe we will do this. And I kind of made this executive decision we would not actually do this. And they seemed to be okay with it, but then we made a decision, well, maybe we'll just take a little Sony camera, and just put it in the back of the room and at least have some form of, record of what was being taught. And then about 2 weeks after that, I flew to Singapore. At the time, I was working with the Love Singapore churches and to help them focus on the unreached and the least reached of Southeast Asia. And it was just a wonderful time to work with the churches of Singapore. But whilst I was there, I walked into somebody's office, and on the floor were 3 huge big cameras. And I said to this guy that I didn't really know well, I said to him, and what are these? He says, oh, those are broadcast quality cameras. And I said, what are you doing with them? He says, I'm busy selling them. And I said, would you please keep them? I'm buying them. And before I could catch myself, I'd already said it. And then I said, by the way, how much are they? And when he told me, I just about died. Because they were a huge amount of money. And so anyways, what happened is I left there, flew back to South Africa with absolute peace in my heart. It was just like a God thing that had happened. And when we got to South Africa, within a week, the Lord supplied the money. We sent the money over to Singapore, and these cameras were coming on their way to South Africa. Well, by that time, I had to go repent with my team and say, you know what? I had told you we're not doing this. I made this executive decision, but now I'd gone and bought the cameras. And so immediately I realized now we have to do the other things that Marcus spoke about, because he said I need broadcast quality cameras, he said I need a studio, etc. So I started to look for a studio. And the more I went to a professional studio, the more they said to us, we don't want you. And eventually I was like, you've got to explain this to me. And they said, you know what, we're commercial studios. If you come and spend 6 months in our studio, then all our clients would be gone, and so you're not good for our business. So no, we can't help you. So I became desperate. And one evening, Lydia's my wife, Lydia and myself, we were meeting with Pastor Neville Norden and his wife Rena in Pretoria. We're friends, and we were just having dinner together. They did not know about what I've just told you about. They knew that we were reaching out to the 100 unreached people groups, but they didn't know about all the video stuff, because frankly, it wasn't really in my focus. It was just a by-the-way thing. But during the dinner, Rena said to me, she said, Willie, we don't understand something. God keeps telling us to give you our chapel for a year. Now understand, this is a church of about 6,000 members. They use this chapel for all their weddings, for all their funerals, for all kinds of events. And I looked at her and I said, what do you mean, give me your chapel for a year? And Pastor Neville said, we'll give you the keys and it's yours. We'll take all our activities out of it. It's your. And I said, immediately said, can I turn it into a studio? And he said, you know what? You can do whatever you want, as long as you give it back to us like you got it. Well, needless to say, the next week we were up there putting up, the necessary lighting and whatever, and we started to soundproof this thing, and suddenly we had the studio. So we had the cameras, we had the studio, and then to my absolute horror, I found out that I needed over R1 million equipment to connect the cameras to. And I thought, I'm fired. My board is not going to allow this. This is the end of my ministry. And I thought, I don't know where or how I would even raise that money. There was too little time to even try to raise it. And even if I could raise it, I'd probably have to do it overseas. And if I did do that, I would have to probably import that equipment. And there was no ways that I had the time to do that. And whilst all this was happening, and this became a very sort of a time of turmoil in my own life, in that week I walked and found in the city, I found a friend of mine just walking in the street, and his name is Jan. And Jan said to me, he was all excited. He said to me, Willie, we are busy putting together an outdoor broadcasting unit. And Jan is a man that lays carpets, okay? He's a businessman. And I like, Jan, what in the world are you going to do with an outdoor broadcasting unit? He said, no, well, we're going to take video of what God's doing in the townships and all different parts of South Africa. We want to show the South Africans some good news. And I said, Jan, how far are you with your project? And Jan said, Willie, we have the truck. We have all the equipment. We have an engineer on board. We just don't have the cameras. And I said to him, Jan, can I talk to you about what's in my office? And I explained to him these Sony cameras that were lying in my office. And he looked at me with eyes this big and he said, those are the cameras we are believing God for. So we cut a deal. We said, would you give us an engineer? And would you let us use your equipment, take it out of your truck, build it into our makeshift studio? And then at the end, when we finished videoing this whole thing, then we will give you the cameras as payment. And of course they agreed, and it was a win-win situation, and so both of us were able to win in that process. So the day came and the students came. The 50 came, we trained them in South Africa. The 500 came, and actually, in fact, they weren't 500, they were 483 that ultimately came in Southern Africa. And we trained those in those countries. And the day came that we were finished with all of the videoing, and we were on these, these big old SP videos, broadcast quality videos. And so I was on my way to Africa. My heart was to get to these unreached people groups. My heart was to make sure that the church was being started among them. And so I said to the principal of our school, I said to him, why don't you take these big videos and why don't you just show them to another group of students and let's see what happens. And so while we were all in Africa, he showed them these videos, and almost a year later, that's how much or how little I understood of what was going on. Almost a year later, I sat down with Kevin and I said, Kevin, how are the students? And he says, we've got fantastic students. They're in different parts of Africa. They're busy reaching out to, some of these unreached people groups that you guys are working on. And I was like, well, praise God. Do it again, Kevin. And so Kevin did it again. He did it the second time. And after the 6 months was over, where they had gone through their classroom phase, I sat down with him really for the first time. I said, Kevin, how far or where are these students? And he said, They've gone to the desert in Botswana. They're working among the Bushmen out there, and they're doing a fantastic job. And for the first time, I made a decision. Let me get into a 4x4. Let me drive to the desert, and let me go and see what's happening out there. And when I got to the desert, I just pitched my little two-man tent, and I sat amongst these students. I watched their love for the Lord. I watched their love for one another. I watched their prayer life. I watched their commitment to reach these people. And for the first time in all of what I said to you, for the first time, I heard the Lord say, do you know what you have in your hand? And I didn't. Therefore, I can say to you categorically today that the Life School was never our idea. It wasn't that we were clever. It wasn't that we tried to put it together. We were too stupid to see what God was doing. Over a period of almost 3 years. Anyways, I got back to Pretoria after that experience. I bought a ticket, flew back to Marcus in the States, and I said, Marcus, I have 240 hours of video. I want to put it onto digital technology. And he just said to me, you're absolutely nuts. There's no way you could pay the bill to make that happen. And we were sitting around a big boardroom table, and as we were sitting around that table, I was asking these questions, and every time I asked a question, I would be discouraged. No, don't do it. And eventually, his cell phone rang, and he walked out the room, and I had all his engineers sitting around the table, and I pulled a piece of paper closer, and I said to them, I said, tell me, what do you do when you translate, or rather, when you do this project? And they started to tell me, we do A, B, C, and I started to write all that stuff down, and eventually greeted them, left, flew back to South Africa, and I came to our media department, and I said, guys, here's the list. This is what you have to do. I didn't know what I was saying. The first thing they had to do was type every word on those videos. That translated to about 4,800 pages of typed notes. And then that went to a group of theologians that actually went and highlighted all the excess words, all the ums and ahs and whatever. And then it went back into an editing studio where they worked 6 days a week in 3 shifts, 22 hours a day for almost a year to edit out all the excess words, to the point where now, at long last, in 2005, 5 years later, we were able to put the English version of the Live School onto DVD. We've got the compressions down. We had 3 videos on a DVD, and we were now able to use 93 DVDs to actually present our school. And with great fanfare, we launched the English version. Immediately began to go to some of the small churches in Southern Africa, where we began to train or help them train their people and watch those pastors send their people to go and plant churches in the unreached areas around them, and with amazing results, to say the least. But what I had seen originally with Marcus was that he spoke in different languages. And so I thought, well, let's start to translate this thing into some language. And we eventually spoke with CBN in Kiev in the Ukraine. And we eventually asked them whether they would help us to translate into Russian, a culture that is far removed from the South African or English culture. I wanted to see, would it work in a different culture like that? And eventually we did translate it into Russian. We began to roll out in the Russian world with great success, and I don't have time this morning to tell you what has all happened and still happening in the Russian world as we speak. But we then decided, well, let's continue to do the translation, and we translated into Arabic, and from Arabic we translated into Swahili, and then into Turkish and Farsi and Korean, and the latest of our translations is in French. And Lord helping us, we will be translating another 6 languages, and we feel like that's the mandate the Lord's given us, to translate into 13 of the world's trade languages, where so we're able to use this curriculum in that situation. If I think about these years, and I think what God's done, and I see now the hundreds of schools in many parts of the world, and I see the thousands of people that are being trained, and I see the thousands of churches that some of them have started, then I realize the Lord is saying, time's short. And the Lord's saying, let's get after those that have never heard the gospel. And the Life School, I believe, is a tool that the Lord put together that would help to train missionaries at the rock face, train missionaries close to the unreached, where they in turn could go and plant churches among those. As you watch this video, and I close, you may be one of those that's going to make a decision that as a facilitator or as a pastor, I'm going to go to a group of people that I will train. And you'll become one of those in a team around the world to help us train 1 million people to reach the last of the unreached. You know something? If 10% of that million stayed in the field, we'd add 100,000 missionaries to finish the job. The Lord bless you.